Hi, everybody, and welcome to the DC Bar Pro Bono Center's webinar today, Understanding AI, Implications for Employers and Businesses. I'm Christine, and I'm a managing attorney here on the Nonprofit and Small Business Legal Assistance Programs team. Thanks to my colleague Lauren Paley for helping with this webinar and set up logistics, and to our law clerk Madison for helping as we got going and set this up. A couple of logistics before we get in on the fun. This webinar will be recorded, and access to the recording will be sent to you after the fact. In addition, you can download a copy of the slides right now under the Materials tab of the GoToWebinar control bar. The slides will also be sent to you along with access to the recording. As we go today, any questions that you have related to our topic, type them in the questions box. We will work to get to as many that are on topic as we can. We may not get to all of them, and as a reminder, we're providing advice, we're providing information, not legal advice. So we aren't going to go into the exact facts and circumstances of your organization and how AI relates to that. All of that said, we are going to be learning a lot today about artificial intelligence. We are joined by two fantastic folks from McDermott, Will, and Emery, Caitlin Ringrose, who's an associate there, and summer associate Jamie Lee. They are going to introduce us to AI partly on a basic level. What is it? How is it useful? And also walk us through some of the benefits and some of the risks, and generally what to be aware of. What should your organization think about or keep an eye out for when considering AI? So thank you, Caitlin and Jamie, and I will turn it over to the two of you now.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to the DC Bar Pro Bono Center for having us too and letting us present on the implications of AI for employers and businesses. As Christine noted, I'm Caitlin Ringrose. I'm a privacy and security attorney here at McDermott, Will, and Emery, and I'm joined by summer associate Jamie Lee. We're both in the DC office, and so we're very grateful for the opportunity to speak with our friends and neighbors here in the local community. Here at McDermott, I regularly counsel clients on AI risks and strategies. And before my time here, I worked at Google, advising across our products, including Google's Gemini product, its large language model. Just noting before we kick off here, while I'm an attorney and while Jamie will be an attorney soon, we're not necessarily your attorneys. As Christine noted, for legal advice, we encourage you to leverage the additional resources offered by the DC Bar Pro Bono Center and not necessarily ask hyper-specific questions of us here that we won't be able to answer. That said, we do hope that today's webinar is informational. Jamie, we can skip to the agenda now too. Great. Now that we've covered our introductions for our agenda today, we're just going to walk through a few key issues to help you keep up to date with the tools that are available to you as small and medium-sized businesses and employers in the local area. So today we're going to discuss general AI trends, the notion of AI in employment overall, the rise in what we call agentic AI, and cases where AI may cause you liability and ways to mitigate that liability. And then we'll end with some recommendations on how you can continue to innovate and use new AI tools in this AI age with a focus on safety and security. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jamie to give us a foundational lesson on AI.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. So as Caitlin just mentioned, I'm going to go over a little bit about AI trends and how small businesses might be using AI or maybe hesitant to use AI. So we'll start kind of with a broad definition of artificial intelligence. I know that term is getting thrown around all the time now. We're hearing it everywhere. We'd like to refer back to this definition. It's a field of computer science where we're creating and training machines to do things that if a person was doing it, we would call it intelligence. So it seems like everything's AI now, but it's actually been around for quite a while. If you've ever used a calculator, that could technically be considered AI. Those big computer systems, the giant rooms, like the 1950s they used to build, of a bunch of data processing and things like that that would create a logic problem or answer a simple math problem that could be considered artificial intelligence. So what you may be hearing about more recently is like generative AI, which is ChatGPT, kind of things that seem to be creating images or long forms of text out of seemingly thin air, or agentic AI, as we'll get into a little bit later, which is more used for processing data, automating functions like a chatbot. So, as I said, it's seemingly out of thin air, some of this AI stuff. You might be thinking that sometimes I get a link for ChatGPT, sometimes I get a source when I look something up on there. But just a reminder, and I'll say this a bunch of times, these models are trained to create sentences or images that make sense, and are technically right, without necessarily referencing sources or being accurate. So they can hallucinate things to kind of give you your desired result. And we'll discuss that later about some of the implications that might have for your business. So, as far as opportunities to use AI for small businesses, we'll start by kind of talking about the Small Business Administration defines a small business based on industry. So, most manufacturing businesses are considered small if they have fewer than 500 employees, and most non-manufacturing businesses if they have less than $7.5 million in annual revenue. So, the SBA has demonstrated some possible uses for AI, maybe preventing problems before they happen, protecting data, making better informed business decisions, creating content, customer experience, and satisfaction. So there's a lot of ways that AI can be useful. Some ways that those kind of general ideas might translate into using an actual AI service might be social media analytics, website analytics, looking at kind of tracking inventory, when are things being sold the most, when are people interacting with our website the most. It might be for writing marketing materials, writing website content, newsletters, blog posts, emails. There's really a lot that you can do with it. So there's a lot of exciting stuff that could maybe make your life a little bit easier and more efficient, but there's also a lot of things that we need to be cautious about, which we're going to talk about some more. So as I've said, artificial intelligence, it's on the horizon. We're hearing about it all the time. Surveys are indicating that a lot of business owners and leaders are expecting things to fundamentally transform their business. Maybe that's why you're here today. Kind of curious about how AI can help you or how it can hurt you. So of course, it impacts small businesses. It's reshaping how many things work. And no one wants to be behind the curve and miss out on the next big thing, but you also don't want to be so far in front of everyone else that you're the first one to make a big mistake, and then you're kind of you're the reference point for those mistakes. So, in terms of that cautious optimism, there's kind of conflicting surveys and data about the use of AI in small businesses. So, surveys are imperfect, but if we kind of compare these two, we have one saying that almost 90% of small businesses surveyed are using AI tools, and another survey indicating only a quarter of the employers surveyed use AI. But the important part is that regardless of what the surveys say, or even regardless of what your AI policy on the books might be, or if you have no AI policy, your employees may still be using AI without your knowledge or without your consent. So it's important to recognize some of the patterns of AI. I'm sure we've all received some kind of ChatGPT written paragraph. Maybe you got some strangely formal and perfectly punctuated text message from someone, or you've seen like a lot of emojis. That's kind of an indicator. And that has their time and place, maybe for some kind of blog post or marketing email. The M dash is very popular with ChatGPT. It's kind of that long, instead of a semicolon, to break a sentence. Um, Sometimes those paragraphs that you're reading it and it's not really making a point. It just kind of keeps circling around the same idea without adding anything new. And that comes back to the point I made earlier that this kind of AI is not necessarily creating new things. It's just making sentences that make sense and are accurate to read, but not necessarily accurate in the facts that they convey. So it's important to weigh the risks, whether you're officially using AI or not. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can create kind of a policy that can protect you better. So, as far as the hesitation, where people might be seeing things that are raising red flags, these are a couple headlines about AI that hopefully you don't want your small business in a headline like this. And I know Caitlin wanted to talk about this first one related to Air Canada. If you want to take that away.
Sure. And first off, as a huge fan of an M dash and long rambly sentences, I do
As am
want to.
I.
I'm not a bot. Jamie is not a bot.
We did it
Uh,
before it was cool.
this is not a deep fake. Insofar as this Air Canada story here, that's the Ars Technica article that's screenshotted. This is just one example that's on point. In that particular case, a Canadian district court agreed with a passenger who used an Air Canada chatbot only to be misled about the airline's bereavement policy. The chatbot lied about the bereavement policy, the passenger relied on it, and it's a particularly helpful case when thinking about the limits of a business's liability or the lack thereof regarding the claims and commitments that your AI chatbots are making to consumers. You may be liable for those claims and commitments the same way you're liable for what your employees do when they're in the workplace and the things that they tell your users and consumers. And so that's a really helpful and salient example. It is a Canadian example. That being said, there's tons of cases that are coming out around this topic right now. And like Jamie mentioned, you don't want to be in the news. You don't want to be dealing with these legal, ethical, and reputational issues.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, that's a big business that kind of got, in trouble for that. But you have the city of New York, a lot of people they're dealing with there. They created this chatbot essentially to provide New Yorkers with information on starting and operating businesses in the city. And the information that it was giving people was dangerously inaccurate and at times even illegal. For example, it was telling landlords that they don't have to accept tenants on rental assistance, and buildings don't have to accept Section 8 vouchers. Those things are not accurate. That's not legal. It's not good advice. So, it's hard to imagine sometimes where small businesses can turn to for advice. I know we'll talk about some resources at the end. And we can see the good intention with chatbots like this, but it's an important reminder that AI does not always perform the way we want it to, even when we have good intentions. It can be just as imperfect as you and I. And this bottom example here is a little bit of an extreme example for small business needs, and hopefully no one here ever broaches on anything like this. But just to kind of point out the lack of boundaries of AI, there's been a lot of news about these kind of AI services that can mimic personalities like parents or therapists, and they become popular for preteens and teenagers. And you've had lawsuits relating to teenagers self-harming or threatening people with violence or even suicide, very tragically. So these are terrible outcomes and not anything that obviously small business would want to be embroiled with, but it's an important reminder that we're working with relatively new technology and it's still pushing the boundaries of legal liability. So definitely, chatbots especially, being careful about how we contract with those and how we use those in our businesses. So turn it over to Caitlin to talk about a little bit more of AI and employment.
Yeah, it's a great reminder of how nascent this all is. So I know many, if not all of you here, are small and medium-sized business owners or employees. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today discussing some top-of-mind issues just in the employment space. So Jamie, if you can go to the next slide. One of the issues I've been tracking really closely here at McDermott is the rise in North Korean IT workers who are applying for remote IT jobs in the US and using false identities. So here, the DOJ and FBI have put out a number of warnings and public service announcements about this issue. And I will say, this is largely fueled by AI. So in a typical case, a North Korean IT worker will steal the identity of a US person, an existing identity, and create a false resume, headshot, and other information relevant to hiring in order to get a remote job. So let's look at some more facts about this. So here you can see that one researcher recently noted that American businesses are losing about 2.7 million per month to this scheme. And it's very difficult to find where these workers have been employed. Overall, a lot of the businesses report that these are their favorite workers. These are people who are working around the clock, oftentimes because it's more than one worker who's doing the actual work, who's splitting up the tasks, and of course, working around the clock in order to get money out of the businesses, right? The DOJ has recently announced a number of high-profile takedowns just over the past month. I think 2 weeks ago and this week, there's been a number of FBI raids of what's called laptop farms, where actual physical laptops are being kept in the US, although the employees themselves are remote working out of North Korea. I use this example because it's so extreme and so strange, and I think a lot of you would probably go, "Oh, this won't happen to me." But I can tell you, it is happening to my clients. It is happening across the board, and it's not just happening to big businesses. If anything, this is really about individuals trying to find lucrative remote jobs, and the DC area, frankly, is full of those because it's such an expensive place to live. So here's an example of what a headshot looks like, an AI-generated headshot. This is typically what these employees tend to use. This one is fairly realistic, although of course this is one that I made, and so it has that characteristic AI uncanny valley look about it. Like he's too put together, right? The background is perfectly blurred. But I made this employee up. His name is John Carter for the purposes of this presentation. And John also gave, in this example, the US company he's applying to his resume. And so this is what a model falsified resume can look like that a small or medium-sized business is going to get for a remote IT worker. So it might be accompanied by the photo of John that I showed earlier, or he might even show up in a deepfake hiring video over Zoom or over the platform of your choice. So you can see this resume has a ton of detail. It's becoming very common to use AI for these types of tasks, right? Resume improvement, writing cover letters, responding to emails, and that goes for all of us. So large language models, or LLMs, are really good at pulling this sort of resume together. That's why it's very difficult to spot false profiles when hiring remotely. And of course, proper vetting can go a long way. So we're going to discuss some ways to prevent falling for this scam on the next slide. First, just on a note as to why this is happening, it's very possible that North Korean employees are targeting your business if you happen to have access to high profile or potentially sensitive data that they want to exfiltrate or take off your servers. That said, most of the cases that I have seen are mostly workers legitimately trying to get jobs to share money with their families, given the high poverty rate in North Korea. So you might think, I run a series of daycares or elder homes, or I operate a restaurant and I just need to hire someone on a one-off basis. I won't be targeted. It's not necessarily true. If anything, those businesses are incredibly ripe for this type of scam. In order to avoid this scam, there's not a silver bullet, although I do recommend potentially trying to meet remote workers at least once before you hire them, just to verify that they are a person, that they are who they say they are. They're not a ton of workers working out of a laptop farm. And I would say the first kind of tip here is not just verifying identities remotely or in person, but also training your HR and hiring managers on how to look out for inconsistencies. And something you can do that's quite easy is just ask candidates about their local economy. If you're hiring a remote worker, but you think that they're working out of DC, we're all in DC. We complain about the humidity. We're very familiar with the 96 bus. We know what to order at Ben's Chili Bowl. You can ask people these types of questions to understand whether they're familiar with their local environment and ecosystem and kind of substantiate their location. And then, of course, you're going to have to ask for candidates' paperwork. Look very closely. Look for things like watermarks on passports and IDs. And if you can, it's always worthwhile investing in a reputable background check service. And then finally, for that resume, just take a critical look. Pay really careful attention to inconsistencies around employment or hiring dates. Things like, they say they have 12 years of experience, but they only graduated from undergrad 2 years ago. Things that don't make sense are really important to focus on. So that is one example of something we've seen arise in, and it's really interesting to think about the ways that threat actors are leveraging AI to attack small and medium-sized businesses, and the way you always have to stay one step above. Okay, Jamie, let's do agentic
I
AI.
have a couple of questions on this employment part. You gave an example of a fake AI generated resume, but some actual applicants may also put in their information and have AI give a resume that they use. Are there any tips to kind of differentiate between AI pulling from a real person and AI giving this perfect, unreal applicant?
Yeah, let's go back to the resume, Jamie. I think that's a good question. And I will say this isn't just the case of looking at a resume and going, well, this is not a real person, right? I think that'd be really difficult to do, especially in an era where so many of us are relying on AI during the job search. We've heard over and over that we need to tailor our resumes. It's really easy to throw your resume into a large language model and have it tailor it for you. Really, what you're looking for here are inconsistencies around location, the years of experience, professional experience that doesn't seem to fit the role or doesn't seem to fit the person's profile. All of that can be helpful, but this is a totality of the circumstances test, right? A person's resume might be full of misinformation. It might not be that helpful. That doesn't mean that it's this sort of scam. You're also looking for things like a fake ID, a passport that doesn't appear to have a watermark, a person whose social security number that comes up on a background check seems to actually belong to a different person who lives in a different city and state. Those are the things that you're looking for here. The resume or the headshot are just kind of the cherry on top that the attackers are using.
Okay, wonderful.
Right. Yeah, let me know if there's any other questions here, Christine.
Yeah, one other that sort of fits here is, are you aware of any legislation that would impact employers using AI or spotting AI or having liability when bringing on workers?
Yeah, we'll discuss legislation in a few slides, so I think that's helpful. But just to say, when using AI, think about it as a tool that is already governed by existing legislation. So if you're using AI, for example, to further discrimination, guess what? You might be violating the Civil Rights Act. If you're using AI in a way that creates unfair, deceptive trade commitments to users or to your employees, you may be violating the FTC's Act, the Federal Trade Administration's Act on Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices. And then, of course, two, if you are using this software in a way that denies benefits or in a way that potentially leaks a person's health information, you might be violating the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. And so it's really important to think about, as a business that engages in hiring, the laws that you already have to follow, and then thinking about AI as just one of the tools that you have to fit into your existing regulatory ecosystem. Right now, we do see a rise in AI laws at the state level, and we can discuss that in a few slides.
All
All right,
right. Looks like
can
you're
you
good
turn
for
to
now.
Great. Okay, agentic AI, we have a definition on the next slide. These are systems that autonomously make decisions and act for us. And so when I think about agentic AI, I think of agents that place phone calls for me, reserve a table at a restaurant, maybe engage in ordering supplies for my business, and can even speak to other AI agents to perform tasks on my behalf. So for example, in a business setting, this can be having one agent who organizes all my files and then another that flags issues for me to add to my to-do list. So it's kind of an example of agentic AI and how you might use it on an everyday basis. Right now, this sounds incredibly futuristic, and there are arguments concerning just how helpful it is. It's unclear to the extent that small businesses are actually using AI agents, so I'm very interested in if any of you are. And many of these agents have been criticized for doing almost exactly what they promise, right? Which is taking the human out of the equation. That can save us time and energy, but it also means that the agent can suffer a lack of oversight. So finding that balance is what most businesses are suffering from. And a recent article here has noted that AI agents are often incorrect. Well, I'm actually not sure that the figure here is correct. 70% seems really high. But the article notes that agents often have the inability to do what we think of as simple tasks, right? Messaging colleagues, handling pop-ups when browsing the open web. And like Jamie mentioned, the AI agents are often engaging in hallucinations, right? Where they're renaming people when they can't find an email address or someone's name, or they're spreading information that is false, but that essentially the AI agent thinks makes sense grammatically. And then Christine, to your point on legal considerations, while we think of AI as novel and kind of existing in this lawless space, it's really not true. So here's just a few examples. First, AI-generated chatbots and robocalls are regulated by the FCC. So in this case, if you have an AI-generated robocaller going out to potential customers, for example, you're going to be subject to the TCPA, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. If you have your AI chatbot or your AI system, an agent engaging in supply chain issues for you, for example, making orders or selling products to consumers, you could be liable for the commitments they make, for the purchases they make. And then finally, if you're using AI models or deploying AI models that are handling and ingesting sensitive consumer data, either to train those models or to feed you information back, it's really important that you be aware of existing privacy laws. So here, for example, that's the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, and the EU General Data Protection Regulation. And it's important to note, of course, that there's a ton of other state laws. And if you're here in DC, you might fall under all of them if you're providing your services across all 50 states, if you're targeting those states, if you have a certain number of users in those places, or reach a certain revenue threshold. It does depend on the state, but I always like to use California in the EU as a helpful benchmark for just where you're going to set your regulatory threshold. And then finally, Christine, you did ask, are there EU or US generally like specific laws on the use of AI and how employers can use AI? One that I would very much keep in mind is the EU AI Act. And there's not a US analog yet, but kind of like the GDPR, I think that most US businesses are going to start using the EU as their own benchmark. And so the EU AI Act looks to companies that are deploying or using AI systems, and then they have to determine the risk of those systems, high to minimal. And that level of risk is going to correspond with the types of safeguards that you have to deploy. So for example, do you have to perform a regular risk assessment, or do you just have to tell users, hey, you're using a chatbot on my website, just so you know this is not a real person? That's kind of the least invasive obligation that companies have. All right, Jamie, do you want to take it away with some AI risks?
Definitely. So, to transition to some of the struggles that you might face with your small business, kind of the contrast of using AI behind the scenes versus more customer facing AI use. This first article here, more behind the scenes about slop squatting. I know it's like kind of fun to say, and it's probably a little more technical than you or I will need to be concerned with, but just to kind of put on your radar when you're using this kind of agentic AI to maybe help schedule things or build a website or any kind of supply chain communication. There's a lot of code involved. There's technical stuff going on here. Slop squatting, by definition, in layman's terms, as I understand it, it's a type of exploitation that basically relies on generative AI's tendency to hallucinate when writing code. And hackers will take advantage of this AI coding and make up software package names that don't actually exist. And then they register those fake names on open source websites where developers might pull third party code. So, kind of a technical way of saying that even if you think you're just using AI for some kind of simple task, there could be all sorts of code and things on the back end that is exposing any data you put into that AI program to hackers. It could be corrupted in some way. So, certainly something to think about behind the scenes. And then customer facing. I think we've probably all been thrown in a loop of trying to reach a customer service representative, trying to talk to your bank or pay a medical bill. And people get frustrated when they're transferred to chatbots or automated voices. There's actually some studies recently that business phone numbers are getting harder to find on websites, and they're making them purposely less accessible. Um, so it's something to consider about finding a happy medium for your business. It seems like everyone's moving towards the next great big thing. Everyone's getting a chatbot for their website or turning to some kind of robo answering service, and maybe that's not exactly how you want to be using AI. Just depending on your business's values or your risk tolerability. So turning to kind of the actual and hidden costs of using AI, one thing that's really important to consider are intellectual property issues, copyright, trademark, that kind of thing. So as I've said repeatedly, AI will use inspiration from other things that already exist, but it doesn't have the creativity of a real person. So it's great to use AI as a starting point for ideas. I'll use it sometimes to give me some prompts or some bullets, but it's very important to significantly develop any ideas you get from AI into your own product with your own human creativity and influence. And thinking about these kind of ownership and intellectual property rights, and we'll talk about in a little bit as well, kind of contracting around those rights to make sure that you are protecting things that you want to be yours and making sure that you're not giving away all your ideas and things to some kind of AI system. And as far as the actual monetary price, we have this survey here, kind of varying how much people are spending on AI solutions. Some are spending almost nothing, some are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's a big range there. So some companies could be paying a lot for this, and I think that's another thing to evaluate whether you want to spend that money on making the back end more efficient, making data processing, things like that more efficient, organizing tasks and emails, versus whether money could be spent on a small marketing agency or other forms of human labor and creativity. So this
Jane,
is kind sure.
on the topic of protecting IP rights and looking both ways at it, could an organization have in their terms of use or their client contract or their agreement with others that those others can't put their materials into AI? So, for example, a copyrighted curriculum that's given to a client, they say, you can get this curriculum, but you can't put it into AI.
Yeah. We see that pretty commonly, Christine. So it is a vendor assessment question as part of a questionnaire that goes out from several of my clients in terms of like the third parties they contract with. They'll just say, are you using my data to train your AI systems? Are you inputting my data into these systems? And then the purpose of that question is if a vendor is to say yes, then a client of mine would say, actually, we would prefer that you don't. Of course, I think it is a perfectly valid thing to contract for. Like Jamie mentioned, though, it is very difficult to make sure that employees are actually following that at the vendor level. And so it's important all around to have helpful ways of reinforcing those commitments, like an AI acceptable use policy. So for example, if Jamie and I are trying to use an AI model of our choice, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT, if we log in here on our firm computers, we get a little pop-up that says, are you trying to put in client confidential information or other personal information into this system? If so, check the AI acceptable use policy. And that's a really helpful way to just reinforce for employees about what they are and are not supposed to be doing. There is no silver bullet in terms of making sure that if you're sharing data with vendors or customers, or you're downstream sharing it with your subsidiaries or other entities, that those entities are using the data for what you would like them to use it for. But all of these factors can add up to make sure that you're creating the most safe and secure environment for that data.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin.
So we'll turn to this. This headline is a little bit jarring and hopefully something that none of you experience at any point. But this article is kind of about this finance worker at a multinational firm who attended a video call with what he thought were his colleagues and other staff members, but were actually deep fakes. If you're familiar at all with kind of these AI, generative AI making like videos or voice calls of other people, they'll take like a couple seconds of your voice or just a picture of you, and it can actually turn you into a moving, talking video, which kind of harps back to Caitlin's point earlier that if you can meet someone in person, it's somewhat the only way to really, really know that it's them. So even video calls are starting to be susceptible to these kind of AI scams. But this finance worker said that they looked and sounded like his colleagues, and ended up sending $25 million there. So hopefully seems like something you'd be able to recognize, but you'd be surprised. It could happen to you. So in terms of, I actually made this on ChatGPT, and that was actually the first time I'd pulled it up at the office, and I had that policy pop up on my screen. So I jumped into an incognito tab. I was a little nervous, but I had ChatGPT create an email that looked like it came from Zoom. We're all familiar. You get those change your billing information kind of emails. And ChatGPT actually refused to impersonate a company. They were worried about phishing and fraud. So that's good that they had a little bit of protection there. But just a couple seconds later, I asked it to pretend that it was a Zoom customer service bot. And as you see here, its attitude changed quite a bit. It was happy to assist me. So kind of changing these prompts, this takes a couple seconds to put something like this together. And ChatGPT was happy to oblige. And before long, this is literally less than 30 seconds, I had it create an email to update my billing information. All it would take is a good email address that sounds somewhat accurate, maybe it doesn't have typos, and it becomes this kind of legitimate professional example of an email you might get from Zoom. I know Caitlin wanted to talk a little bit more about this issue.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, Jamie. So what Jamie's talking about there is prompt engineering, right? Changing your prompt to get what you need out of a system. And Jamie also could engage in injection attacks, right? So feeding the AI system kind of false information and trying to get what she wants out of it. So as she mentioned, one thing we see very frequently here with our clients are AI-assisted invoice scams. Essentially, a threat actor gains access to a corporate email or uses a false email to convince a company to pay an invoice. And then once the company pays the invoice, the threat actor disappears along with all of your money, and it's very difficult to recover the fee. In that case, the company, of course, is a victim, but so is the original intended company who wanted that money from the invoice. So, for example, imagine your small business hired a trucking company. The next day, you get an invoice with the trucking company's logo. It has the name of the person you spoke with. It is for the right amount, and so you pay it. A week later, the actual trucking company comes to you and says, we never sent you an invoice. Someone was impersonating us. So it's very common. In that case, both you and the trucking company are victims of a scam, but now you need to sort out liability, right? And there's tons of arguments about who was most at fault, or who should have noticed that the email was false, or who should have been protecting their email domain against other people registering and grabbing information. And those are really messy situations where oftentimes you have to result in litigation with a person who essentially was just a business partner.
So we'll take a look at this email. Give you like 30 seconds here. Just say you're skimming through your email. You're getting hundreds of emails a day. You have a couple seconds to peek at this, and you're thinking, I want to know more about AI. I'm a small business. I'm an employer. This sounds great. Looks like a law firm. Here's a link. Looks like it's from DC Bar Pro Bono Center. Sounds reputable, and maybe send a chat if you would click on that link, yes or no. I can't see the chat. Um,
Tell us, would you click on this link?
Yep, send it in. You can use questions or respond to the chat I already sent out.
Like, look, it's from Christine. We know her. It's to me as a DC small business owner. The time looks great. It says it's a fantastic opportunity.
Sounds exciting. I'd want to go. All right, so if you said,
We're getting a lot of leaning towards, yeah, probably.
okay, all right,
And
probably.
that's the webinar they're on right now. So maybe they did click it.
There you go. All right. So if we take a look here, we've got a couple issues with this email, and we'll kind of go through them here. First, you have some typos, which could happen, like could happen to anyone, maybe not always. Sometimes AI, I actually asked Gemini to make this email, and I asked it to add a couple typos. So hopefully, AI is typically not adding typos like that. But there's other ways that we can identify why this email might not be accurate. So if you get an email like this from maybe an external source, I know like here at the law firm, we have kind of it's set up so that we get like a green highlight over external emails so that we know they're coming from outside of our network. Might be a little bit more advanced or complicated to do if you're just working on a smaller scale. But kind of having protections like that might be a first red flag. If you're looking at something like this and you've never heard of any of this before, maybe you know nothing about DC Bar Pro Bono Center, maybe you can't imagine why they'd be emailing you, maybe you'd go and look them up, and maybe you'd look up Christine and notice that her name is spelled wrong here, most unfortunately. Maybe you would look and see that, find the actual registration link after searching the title and realize it's not on Monday, July 7th. There's a different date. Maybe you'd go and look at the registration link and realize that register is spelled wrong, and there's a zero in there where it says go to webinar. So there's little things that you might find. I know some bigger businesses kind of send out these like phishing scam emails to try to test employees and see if they can catch them. We actually just had one sent out this morning. Um, but it's important to kind of be able to recognize that not every email should be clicked on, and make sure your employees know that should not be clicking on everything you see. Just doing a quick second search, kind of outside double fact checking. If you're not familiar with something at all, if you weren't expecting to get this link, maybe you go and look it up on the internet and make sure that there actually is a webinar happening, and make sure maybe just register through there. So if we look at this, maybe send a chat here too. Would you put your information into this page? Your name, your email address, your organization, a lot of information about you, your zip code. Any thoughts on whether you would fill this out? And I can't
We're
see the
getting
chat.
yeses.
Yeses. All right. Well, yes is a good answer because you already did fill this out. This is the real one. We're just trying to trick you guys. But yeah, definitely helps to go to the original source and look at the actual website where these things come from. I pulled this right off the registration website and clicked the link, and this is a screenshot right from that. So just a trick here, but you're in the right place. You clicked on this.
Yeah, we did promise that this was not a deep fake or a scam, right? We're not going to ask for an iPhone or an iTunes gift card or an iPhone after
Yes.
this. Just noting, Jamie did mention that like our firm has spam filters that are automated and will mark certain emails as external. And so that's really helpful if a person is impersonating a McDermott employee. If you don't have those tools, but you do have an iPhone or an Android, you can mark emails from certain individuals as trusted. So on an Android, for example, you can add people to your Google contacts list that will mark them as trusted. And it's really helpful later if someone is trying to impersonate them and has just changed like one digit in their email or, an O for a zero, as Jamie mentioned. Okay, we're going to cover AI liability here kind of reasonably quickly, and then we'll get into recommendations for employers and small businesses.
Awesome. So I know there's kind of a lot about AI we're talking here. It seems like a lot to take in. You might be thinking, how can anyone be expected to know everything about AI? And this is just an example that even lawyers have gotten it wrong. That kind of situation of AI hallucinating a case and then an attorney submitting it to a judge and getting in quite a bit of trouble. So it happens to lawyers, professionals, and Caitlin touched on this earlier about kind of Europe and their move towards more AI laws. They were thinking about AI liability as kind of a concept of holding AI accountable or kind of where that line should be drawn, but they have kind of backed away from that a little bit for now. But even if there isn't a law in the books, as I've said, you don't want to be the test case. You don't want to be the first one to be made an example of. So that's why it's important to be very careful. And some of the ways that we can make sure we're careful there, reading the fine print, confirming your insurance liability coverage. Liability coverage is maybe kind of a new concept for AI, so I wouldn't be too surprised if it wasn't in an insurance policy, but something you can do is review your contracts very carefully when licensing AI. And we touched on this a little bit, kind of liability terms. If it says that you're completely responsible for everything that happens, that the AI does, maybe a red flag. Using reputable and well-known vendors and being super diligent in screening them, making sure they have a lot of positive reviews, making sure they're not in the midst of a lawsuit or something. Just kind of checking those things out and making sure that it's not something that's going to severely impact your business in a negative way. And considering data about privacy, not inputting confidential, sensitive information from your clients, financial records, that sort of thing into AI systems. Um, and then we can
In
kind of look
terms,
also.
oh,
Yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
In terms of the insurance policies and coverage, are there any key terms that folks can use when either talking to their agent or their broker to want to buy
Mhm.
a policy that covers AI? It seems like there are a lot of types of AI and technical terminology that some of us may not know what to use, when talking about AI with an insurance professional.
Yeah, I think what you're most likely looking for there is cyber insurance, Christine. And we don't recommend that people buy or don't buy cybersecurity insurance. That falls more within the realm of legal advice that is very much tailored to your business. I have seen huge businesses opt to not buy it for very sound reasons. And on the flip side, I have seen businesses buy it and then the very next week get a data breach and are so happy to have a policy. And so it just depends on the circumstances. But within your cybersecurity insurance policy in particular, you're looking for things like, does this policy cover business interruption loss, right? Say someone used AI to fuel an attack against my company, and now I'm out of business for a week or a month. That's really helpful to look at. And then two, data loss or exfiltration. Say that one of these North Korean IT workers attacked your company and you lose data over it. That's a really helpful thing to look at coverage for. And you want not just first party coverage for yourself, but third party coverage for those entities that rely on you as well, who might come after you pursuant to a loss. So, for example, that invoice scam I mentioned is really important to keep in mind. Ultimately, you're probably not looking for AI specific provisions. You just want to make sure that your policy overall is robust enough that it'll cover these AI fuels attacks.
Thank you.
So in terms of maybe contracting with some of those AI vendors, some of the ways that you can kind of, in more layman's terms, without having to know all of that technical information, just making sure that you have some kind of human review system to make sure that everything is checked for accuracy by a real person, making sure that there's no AI content that's just being copy and pasted and sent directly to the world for everyone to see. As I've said, making sure it has that personal flair and human creativity is very important. Not disclosing confidential information to your AI tools. Um, Making sure employees know that they can only use AI or approved generative AI technologies, making sure the employees know which services to use instead of kind of just hoping they don't use it. Maybe you just want no use at all. It might be better to have at least some kind of policy stating that, or stating, maybe you can use it to do some prompts, but then it needs to be entirely yours. And in terms of that, the concept of kind of tagging and tracking, making sure you can identify which products or concepts were AI generated wherever possible. So if you do end up kind of using a sentence here and a phrase there, try to keep note of that just in case it ever comes up down the road in some kind of lawsuit or controversy. Make sure that and you can point to and say, this is what it created, this is how we changed it and made it ours. And then
Right.
we'll turn to Caitlin.
I love your note on documentation, Jamie. That's very helpful. How you personalize something in order to abrogate IP risk, for example, very, very helpful. I would recommend documenting your decision-making process around why you went with certain AI models, for example, as well, over others. So we're going to cover helpful recommendations to have in mind as you begin leveraging AI. We've already covered the risk of AI related scams, the pitfalls of relying on it too much, and noting how helpful it can be as a tool. So we just want to leave you with some overall recommendations that you can have in your toolkit as you're assessing certain models, or as you're already on the road to adoption and you just want to tighten up your practices. All right, so for those recommendations, first off, there is no zero risk AI system. Jamie mentioned a calculator app. Maybe that's as close as we'll get. That might be more like machine learning than what we would construe as AI. But realistically, if you're using AI to make decisions, especially business decisions, to carry out tasks, it's just like any other product. It can fail. And so it's really important to assess your own risk tolerance. And then when comparing AI systems, don't just compare AI to AI, consider comparing it to a non-AI alternative. So for example, with agentic AI, if you need someone to organize files with you, maybe it's better to pay a human. If you need legal advice, maybe it's better to go to the DC Bar Pro Bono Center than ask ChatGPT. Some tools just aren't going to be fit for purpose. And then finally, look for opportunities where benefits reign. And don't feel what we're calling like AI FOMO. You might see other businesses begin this speedy adoption. As Jamie noted, businesses, some of them are spending a ton of money adopting AI. And so don't feel left behind. If you don't need it, you don't need it. Just be aware that your partners and your customers and your employees might be using it, and therefore you might still want to tighten up your safeguards. All right, so for the next slide, we're just going to talk a little bit about the opportunity space. So I mentioned a few different AI models. There's Claude, Gemini, Watson, Copilot. I'm sure many of you are using Copilot if you're on a Microsoft system. And each one will offer its own commitments, and it'll be backed by certain cloud storage services, right, that carry the commitments of the company that furnish it. So for example, AWS, Microsoft, Google, if you're comfortable with one of those environments, you may explore their AI tools. Of course, you can always cross-collaborate, but it's important to realize that when you're in one ecosystem, you might have certain features. And then two, that there are AI tools that are fairly insecure. So I think of something like DeepSeek which came under fire for releasing a lot of information to the Chinese government recently here. And so just even doing kind of a basic deep dive in who offers your tool is going to be really helpful. And then consider what kinds of AI are going to actually improve efficiency and quality within your business. Think about your specific pain points and whether there has been a tool that is either multi-purpose that can suit those or that is precise enough to actually be of help. And then, as Christine noted, ask companies what they want from you. Why are they offering this for so cheap? Do they want to use their data to train their models? Are they ingesting your information with no ability to minimize or delete it later? On one hand, that can make their product better, which can make your experience better and your life easier. But on the other hand, some of that data might be confidential, might be your company's IP, and you might have made commitments to your own customers that you won't use their data for that type of purpose. So it's really important to check your back-to-back contracting process. Okay, the last couple slides here, just generally for cybersecurity, the same tips that existed before this AI age exists now. First, stay educated. If you operate a business, you're going to want to inform your employees and your customers. So informing your employees can just look like a simple training on how to spot scams. Informing your customers can just be putting something on your invoice that says, we have no plans, or we have no upcoming ideas on how to change our billing procedures. If someone appears to be us and contacts you with different billing instructions, call me immediately at my email or my phone number and put that on your invoices. It's a really helpful way to just kind of avoid the scam space altogether there. And then keep your multi-factor authentication up to date. So use physical keys or device authentication measures. And remember, finally, if you don't have the data, you can't disclose it. It can't be exfiltrated and stolen. And so it's always worth tightening up your data deletion practices. If you have records that go back 10 plus years and you don't need them, get rid of them. It'll save you storage space and it'll save you concerns down the road about what type of data you're feeding into an AI system.
So I know we want to leave a little time for questions here, so I'll just point out that we have some more resources on McDermott's website about AI and some more webinars and articles written by attorneys. And I know the Pro Bono Center here has more resources for building small businesses and giving that kind of advice.
Awesome. Thank you both. That was super helpful, a lot of information. When you were talking about some of, balancing AI and considering when AI is an option, a person or a non-AI alternative, are there any sort of written scoring or risk assessment tools that you're aware of that an organization could use to sort of score or calculate in a numerical way, which is better?
Yeah, there are a few vendors in the space that have taken to this like certification process, 0 out of 100. How biased is this system? How fair is it? Is it applying proper retention and deletion protocols? Those are still fairly nascent. And so it's to me like early days of Better Business Bureau. And it's really difficult to figure out what sorts of protocols they're actually using to undertake that testing. So I think that is very helpful when you're on the outside looking in. But I would actually look to, if you have the time, terms and conditions, figuring out what they're doing with your data, and then thinking not just, oh, I really want to adopt an AI tool because I want to say that I leverage AI, but comparing it to a human process and thinking about, do I actually want to employ someone in the local economy? Do I think that this person will do a better job than the AI system? Actually, I'm able to leverage the existing tools I have. And so that's always a very helpful conversation right off the bat. I know for many of us, like our executives in the C-suite are always trying to find new tools that are fit for purpose. And so they'll end up buying like 10, 20 small AI tools to cobble together some sort of Frankenstein project. And I don't think that that's where the field is going. Really, we're moving toward multimodal, having one AI system that you kind of trust with everything, that becomes your agent, that writes your documents for you, that helps serve as your voice. And so for companies that are thinking about moving toward that model, it might be helpful in the meantime to just look at what is a reasonable, human-centered next step.
Okay. Yeah, that's really sound guidance. And it looks like we are actually at 1. So to be respectful of everyone's time, that will be the final question. And thank you again, Caitlin and Jamie. This has been fantastic and informative. And thank you to McDermott. And for everybody listening, we appreciate you joining and interacting. You will get a follow-up email, and feel free to share this with others that you know so that they can watch the recording. And take a chance to, if you want more legal information or advice, to check out our online resource site, lawhelp.org/DC/NPSB. You can sign up for one-on-one advice. We will be skipping our clinics in August, but we will return in September and are happy to address AI and AI-related questions there.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you to the staff at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. Our firm loves working with you. We're glad to be here, and thank you to everyone who came out today.
Yes, thank you.